On that quiet autumn morning in rural Pennsylvania, when golden leaves danced through the backyard like ballerinas in their final performance, Henry felt something was different. The air carried a peculiar scent, sweet apples from the old Honeycrisp tree mixed with the earthy dampness of decomposing leaves, and something more indefinable, almost mystical, as if nature herself was preparing a solemn farewell. He woke with a heavy heart, that kind of premonition you only understand after everything unfolds. Every fiber of his 78-year-old being was attuned to the subtle changes permeating the farmhouse, the unusual silence that stretched beyond normal, the absence of morning energy that always heralded the start of another shared day. Beside him, on the old mattress near the fieldstone fireplace he'd built brick by brick decades ago, Charlie still slept, his faithful golden retriever of nearly 15 years, whose coat now carried silver threads like fresh snow, especially around his muzzle and ears. The fireplace, constructed with stones collected from Mill Creek behind the property, radiated comforting warmth. The still warm ashes from last night's fire created a woody aroma that mingled with Charlie's familiar scent, that unique canine fragrance that had become an integral part of this house's essence. Speaking of outdoor adventures, sunny backyard naps, and countless nights of silent companionship. Henry rose slowly, each movement calculated to make no sound. At 78, his movements weren't what they used to be, but he knew every creaking floorboard in this house he'd built with his own hands 5 decades ago. Each piece of wood had its story. The oak staircase he'd personally selected from Miller's lumberyard, the pine floorboards that Martha had helped stain during their early marriage years, when they still dreamed of filling every room with children's laughter. Charlie always woke before him, always stood there with his tail wagging and those bright eyes full of life, eager to go outside. But today was different. There was a quietude in the air that Henry couldn't ignore, a pause in the natural rhythm of life surrounding them. Even the birds outside seemed to sing more softly, as if respecting the sanctity of this moment. Have you ever noticed how animals seem to understand things we can't quite grasp? How they sense changes in the air, in the very fabric of our daily routines? The morning light had that special quality of mid-October in rural Pennsylvania. Crisp, clear, with the promise of frost, but touched with enough warmth to remind you that summer's memory still lingered. Through the windows, Henry could see the sugar maples that lined their gravel driveway beginning their spectacular transformation, their leaves shifting from green to brilliant orange and red. "Charlie, boy," Henry murmured, kneeling beside his companion. The movement made his joints protest, reminders of time's passage that he usually ignored, but which today seemed more pronounced. The dog opened his eyes slowly, as if each eyelid weighed a ton. Still, upon seeing Henry, his tail moved weakly against the braided rug, producing a muffled sound that echoed like music in the old man's heart. Charlie's eyes, once bright as liquid amber in sunlight, now carried a soft haze of age, but still maintained that depth of unconditional devotion that had captivated Henry from day one. His eyelids, slightly drooped, gave him an expression of ancient wisdom, as if he'd absorbed not just years of life, but the very essence of canine experience accumulated through generations. The farmhouse around them seemed to recognize the solemnity of the moment. The grandfather clock in the living room, inherited from Martha's mother back in Ohio, marked the seconds with a softer tick-tock, as if it too were paying its respects. The morning light filtered through windows with oak frames that Henry had installed with his own hands, created golden patterns on the floor that danced gently as leaves moved outside. Charlie's breathing was labored, irregular, with small pauses that made Henry's heart tighten. It was a breathing pattern he recognized, He'd heard the same cadence in Martha's final days, that rhythm speaking of a body preparing for a different kind of journey. Henry knew, after so many years together, after so many shared mornings, so many walks through the Pennsylvania woods where every tree knew their footprints, so many nights when Charlie had been his only company after Martha passed away 3 years ago, Henry knew this would be their last day together. The house itself seemed to understand. The wide plank floors made from chestnut trees that had once covered these hills seemed to creak more softly under Henry's feet. The stone walls, built to last generations, held the warmth of countless fires and the echoes of decades of conversation, laughter, and love. This was a house built for permanence, for raising families and growing old, and it had fulfilled its purpose beautifully. Carefully, he helped Charlie to his feet. The dog trembled slightly, his hind legs failing for a moment before finding balance. Henry felt a lump in his throat, but took a deep breath. He had promised himself long ago that when this day came, he would be strong for Charlie. He would be the kind of companion Charlie had always been for him, patient, loving, present. "How about one last walk, partner?" Henry said, his voice trembling but full of love. "Just like old times." Charlie looked at him with those brown eyes that knew all his secrets, all his silent tears, all his joys. Henry swore he saw understanding in that gaze, a serene acceptance that only animals possess, that unique ability to embrace the present moment without resistance, without fear, only with the simple dignity of those who have lived a life full of devotion. They went out through the back door, Henry gently holding the leather leash he no longer needed to use. Charlie never wandered far from him. The door, made from cherry wood that Henry had worked for weeks to achieve the perfect finish, creaked softly on its well-oiled hinges. The sound was familiar, comforting, a small domestic symphony that had accompanied thousands of exits over the years. The backyard was covered with dry leaves that made a soft, crackling sound under their feet. It was an autumn symphony that Henry had always cherished, each step creating a small explosion of sounds that spoke of change, of cycles, of renewal. The leaves, in shades of gold, red, and brown from the surrounding oaks, maples, and hickories, created a natural carpet extending from the house to the distant tree line. Henry's property stretched across several acres of rolling Pennsylvania countryside, a small paradise that he and Martha had shaped over decades of loving care. The white farmhouse with hunter-green shutters sat in the center like a beacon of home and comfort. Around it, carefully planned gardens gradually blended with wild nature, creating a harmonious transition between the domesticated and the wild. Charlie walked slowly, stopping to sniff here and there as if saying goodbye to every familiar corner. His breathing created small clouds of vapor in the crisp morning air, visible reminders of the life still pulsing within him. His muzzle, now more white than golden, investigated with the same curiosity as always the base of the old garden cart, Martha's rose bed where she'd planted climbing Don Juan and peace roses, the spot where gray squirrels buried their black walnuts. Think about the rituals in your own life, those small, repeated actions that create the rhythm of our days. How do they take on deeper meaning during moments of transition? Henry remembered the day Charlie came into his life. He had been a golden puppy, a ball of fur that didn't fit in his hands. Martha had insisted on getting him from the county animal shelter, saying the house was too quiet since the children, Robert and Susan, had moved out. Robert to Pittsburgh for his engineering job, Susan to Philadelphia, where she taught elementary school. "We need life here, Henry," she had said, holding the little puppy against her chest in the clean but institutional-smelling adoption room. "This place is too quiet without kids running around." and life was exactly what Charlie brought. The shelter had been located in the basement of the old courthouse in their county seat of Millerville. Henry still vividly remembered that day, the smell of disinfectant mixed with the animal scent, the hopeful barking of dogs waiting for a chance to find a family. Charlie had been the only quiet puppy, sitting calmly in his small kennel area, as if he knew that Henry and Martha were destined to find him. "He chose you folks," the volunteer had said with a smile, watching how Charlie immediately snuggled into Martha's arms. Sometimes that's how it works. Animals just know. 15 years of joy, companionship, and unwavering loyalty. 15 years of mornings when Charlie woke him with gentle face licks, lazy summer afternoons in the yard where he chased monarch butterflies and investigated every new scent brought by the wind, evenings when the dog curled up at his feet while Henry read his Louis L'Amour westerns or watched the evening news. And after Martha passed, Charlie had become more than a pet. He had become his anchor, his reason to wake up every morning, his connection to a world that sometimes seemed to have lost much of its color and meaning. They walked past the vegetable garden that Martha had tended so lovingly, now overgrown with autumn weeds, but still bearing the faint outline of her carefully planned rows. The tomato stakes, now dry and brown, still stood like silent sentinels over what had been a thriving garden. Wooden stakes that Henry had cut from locust trees on their own property, knowing they would last for decades without rotting. Charlie paused at the garden gate, his nose twitching as if catching echoes of memories embedded in the soil. Memories of Martha, kneeling among the Better Boy tomatoes and Kentucky Wonder beans, while Charlie lay in the shade of the old apple tree, content to watch her work. Martha's garden had been her pride and joy. She spent hours there every spring and summer, her hands always dirty with Pennsylvania soil, her face always lit with a satisfied smile when the first seedlings sprouted or when she harvested the first ripe tomatoes of the season. Charlie had been her constant companion in these activities, never digging where he shouldn't, never disturbing the plants, as if he intuitively understood the sanctity of this space of creation. "You remember her garden, don't you, boy?" Henry said softly. "How she used to talk to those plants like they were her children, and you listened so patiently, like you understood every word." Charlie's ears perked up slightly at the mention of Martha's name, a ghostly echo of the alert attention he used to show whenever she called. Even in his weakened state, the love and recognition were unmistakable. His ears, soft as velvet and slightly darker than the rest of his coat, still maintained that expressive mobility that had always been part of his eloquent body language. They continued their slow procession toward the back of the property, where the manicured yard gave way to wild Pennsylvania forest. This had been their daily route for years, Henry's morning constitutional and Charlie's adventure playground. The path was worn smooth by countless paws and boots, a testament to their shared routine that had anchored both their lives. The trail began just behind the tool shed that Henry had built in the early years after moving here. The shed, made from the same oak as the house, housed decades of projects, well-maintained tools, half-empty paint cans, pieces of lumber, saved just in case, as Martha always teased. The scent of machine oil and dry wood emanating from the shed was deeply comforting, speaking of completed projects, of problems solved with one's own hands. The forest welcomed them with the cathedral silence that only old trees can provide. Towering white pines and centuries-old oaks formed a canopy overhead, their branches intertwining like fingers of old friends. Dappled sunlight created a mosaic on the forest floor, illuminating patches of moss and the occasional late-blooming aster that had survived the first frosts. The forest's aroma was rich and complex. The clean fragrance of pine needles mixed with the damp smell of earth, the sweet perfume of decomposing leaves, and that indefinable but comforting scent that spoke of wildlife and natural growth. It was an aroma that had become associated in their minds with peace, adventure, and spiritual renewal. Charlie moved more slowly now, but his senses were still sharp. He paused at familiar spots. The hollow log where he'd once cornered a family of raccoons, the creek bed where he'd splashed as a young dog, chasing creek chubs with boundless energy. Each stop seemed deliberate, as if he were conducting his own farewell tour. Notice how memory and place are intertwined, how certain locations hold the echoes of our most precious moments, becoming sacred spaces in the geography of our hearts. Mill Creek, when they reached it, murmured softly over the limestone rocks, creating aquatic music that had been the soundtrack to many of their walks. The water, clear as crystal, reflected the autumn sky and the branches of sycamores and willows that leaned over its banks. Small brook trout occasionally broke the surface, creating concentric ripples that spread until they disappeared. Henry remembered summers when Charlie had spent hours in this creek, his paws creating splashes as he chased reflections in the water or simply cooled off on the hottest days. The dog always emerged from the water with his golden coat darkened and glistening, shaking vigorously and sending droplets in all directions, usually soaking Henry in the process. Henry's mind wandered to the countless adventures they'd shared in these Pennsylvania woods. There was the winter, when Charlie had led him to an injured white-tailed deer, somehow understanding that help was needed. The spring mornings when they'd surprised a red fox mother with her kits, all of them freezing in mutual recognition before going their separate ways. The summer evenings when they'd sat by the creek, Henry reading aloud from Field and Stream magazine while Charlie dozed, both content in each other's company. "Remember that time you got yourself stuck in the old culvert?" Henry chuckled, despite the heaviness in his heart. "You were chasing after that cottontail rabbit, so determined to catch it. Martha and I spent 2 hours trying to coax you out. You were so proud of yourself, covered in mud from head to tail." The old culvert was a remnant from when this area had been farmland decades earlier, made of corrugated metal and half buried under years of accumulated leaves and debris. It had always been a source of fascination for Charlie. That particular day, his enthusiasm had exceeded his judgment, and he'd found himself thoroughly stuck until Henry and Martha could figure out how to extract him safely. Charlie's breathing was becoming more labored, but he pressed on, determined to complete their ritual walk. Henry could see the effort it took, the way his loyal friend summoned strength from somewhere deep within to give them both this final gift. They reached the clearing where an old wooden bench sat overlooking a small pond. Henry had built the bench years ago from lumber milled from a black walnut tree that had fallen in a storm, a place where he and Martha could sit and watch the wildlife. Now it served as a perfect resting spot for him and Charlie. The dog settled beside the bench with a soft sigh, his body finally allowing itself to relax. The bench, weathered to a silver-gray patina, bore the marks of countless hours of use. Henry had carved their initials into one armrest during a romantic moment in their 50s. HW plus MW, surrounded by a heart. The carving had weathered, but remained visible, a testament to enduring love. The pond reflected the autumn sky like a mirror, its surface occasionally disturbed by a mallard duck or the gentle plop of a falling leaf. The water, fed by underground springs, maintained crystal clarity that allowed you to see all the way to the sandy bottom. Aquatic plants swayed gently in the barely perceptible current, creating underwater gardens that housed small fish and salamanders. Henry sat on the bench and gently lifted Charlie's head onto his lap. stroking the soft fur behind his ears, a gesture that had never failed to bring comfort to both of them. Charlie's fur, still soft despite his age, had a unique texture that Henry had come to associate with peace and contentment. "You know, Charlie," Henry began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I've been thinking about all the ways you've changed my life. When Martha first brought you home, I wasn't sure I was ready for a dog. I thought it would be too much work, too much responsibility." Charlie's eyes, though tired, remained focused on Henry's face with unwavering attention. There was a depth in those eyes that went beyond simple canine devotion. It was an understanding that spoke of years of careful observation, of attunement to human emotions, of wisdom that transcended the barriers between species. "But you taught me something I didn't even know I needed to learn. You showed me that devotion isn't a burden, it's a gift. Every morning you woke up excited to see me, like I was the most important person in the world. Even on my worst days, when I was grumpy or sad, you never stopped caring for me." A gentle breeze stirred the water, sending ripples across the pond's surface. Henry watched a great blue heron standing motionless at the water's edge, hunting with the patience that only comes from understanding nature's rhythm. The bird, majestic in its stillness, seemed like a living statue, its eyes focused on the water with a concentration that spoke of instincts perfected over millions of years. "Martha used to say you had an old soul," Henry continued. "She said you understood things that most people never figure out, like how to be completely present in the moment, how to forgive without holding grudges, how to care without conditions or expectations." Charlie made a soft sound, almost like he was trying to respond. The sound emerged from his throat as a low, melodious whine, a vocalization that Henry had heard thousands of times over the years, Charlie's unique way of expressing contentment, understanding, or simply his loving presence. Henry felt tears welling up in his eyes, but he blinked them back. There would be time for tears later. Right now, he wanted to be fully present for Charlie, just as Charlie had always been present for him. This was a lesson he'd learned from his canine companion, the art of being completely in the moment, without being distracted by regrets from the past or anxieties about the future. Consider this profound truth. Sometimes the greatest teachers in our lives walk on four legs, showing us through simple presence what it means to give unconditionally. The sun climbed higher, warming the clearing and bringing out the rich colors of a Pennsylvania autumn. Red maples blazed like torches among the golden oaks, while white pines provided a backdrop of deep, eternal green. Hickory trees contributed their own palette of yellow and bronze, while the occasional dogwood showed off its burgundy fall foliage. Henry told Charlie about the time he'd gotten lost in these very woods as a child, how scared he'd been until his father's old hunting dog, Rex, had found him and led him home. He talked about the continuity of dogs in his life, each one teaching him something different but equally valuable. "Rex taught me about loyalty," Henry said. "Buddy, the beagle I had as a teenager, taught me about curiosity and adventure. And you, Charlie, you've taught me about grace, about how to age with dignity, how to face life's challenges with courage, and how to care completely, even when you know heartbreak is inevitable." As the morning progressed, Henry found himself sharing memories he hadn't thought about in years. The Christmas when Charlie had somehow unwrapped all the presents under the tree, not destructively, but with surgical precision, as if he was helping with the gift-opening process. The thunderstorm that had terrified Charlie as a puppy, and how Martha had spent the entire night on the floor with him, singing lullabies, until he calmed down. "She loved you so much," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. "Those last few months, when she was sick, you never left her side. You knew, didn't you? You knew she was going away, and you wanted to give her every moment of comfort you could. Martha's final months had been difficult for all of them. The cancer had come quickly and progressed, despite all treatments. But throughout that period, Charlie had been a constant, comforting presence. He seemed to understand instinctively when Martha needed space and when she needed company. On days when she felt well enough to sit in the garden, Charlie would lie in the sun beside her. On days when she stayed in bed, he positioned himself on the floor beside her, always vigilant, always present. Charlie's breathing had become more shallow, but his eyes remained alert, as if he were memorizing Henry's face, storing away every detail for whatever journey lay ahead. There was an intensity in that gaze that went beyond simple attention. It was as if Charlie were trying to communicate decades of gratitude and love in a single, prolonged moment of connection. "I want you to know," Henry said, his voice gaining strength, "that these 15 years with you have been the greatest gift of my life. You and Martha, you were my family, my heart, my home. Every single day with you has been a blessing, even the difficult ones." The sun reached its zenith, casting short shadows and filling the clearing with warm, golden light. Henry realized they had been there for hours, but time seemed suspended, as if the universe itself was granting them this extended farewell. Charlie struggled to lift his head, and Henry could see the enormous effort it required, but the dog managed to look directly into his eyes, and in that gaze Henry saw everything. 15 years of shared experiences, countless moments of joy and comfort, and a love so pure it transcended the boundaries between species. "Are you ready to go home, boy?" Henry asked gently. Charlie's tail gave the faintest wag, and Henry understood. Home. It was time to go home. The walk back seemed to take forever and no time at all. Henry carried Charlie part of the way, marveling at how light his once robust companion had become. The dog's weight in his arms was a physical reminder of time's passage, but also a final opportunity to offer comfort and care. Back at the house, Henry prepared Charlie's favorite spot by the fireplace, adding extra blankets to make it as comfortable as possible. The blankets were a mixture of textures and stories. The wool blanket Martha had knitted during their first winter as a married couple. The colorful quilt the children had used when small. The soft throw they'd bought specifically for Charlie when he was a puppy. Henry called Dr. Morrison, their longtime veterinarian, who had become more friend than doctor over the years. "I'll be right over, Henry," Dr. Morrison said, his voice gentle with understanding. "We'll make sure Charlie is comfortable." While they waited, Henry sat beside Charlie, continuing their conversation as if it were any other ordinary day. He talked about the weather, about the book he was reading, a biography of Teddy Roosevelt, about plans for winterizing the house. Normal things, everyday things, because that's what their relationship had always been built on. The beautiful ordinariness of shared life. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, painting everything in soft, golden hues. Charlie's eyes began to close more frequently, but he would force them open whenever Henry spoke, as if he didn't want to miss a single word. Dr. Morrison arrived as the sun was beginning to set, his medical bag in one hand and a look of gentle compassion on his weathered face. He had been treating Charlie since puppyhood, had seen him through every illness and injury, had celebrated his recoveries and worried through his setbacks. The veterinarian was a tall, lean man with graying hair and hands that seemed to have been made specifically for healing. His eyes, blue as a winter sky, carried the wisdom of someone who had spent decades caring for creatures that couldn't speak for themselves. "How are we doing, old friend?" he asked, kneeling beside Charlie and running expert hands over his still form. Henry watched as the doctor examined Charlie with the tenderness of someone who understood that this wasn't just a medical procedure, but a sacred moment between companions who had shared a lifetime together. "He's ready, isn't he?" Henry asked, though he already knew the answer. Dr. Morrison nodded slowly, his expression grave but kind. "His body is tired, Henry. He's been fighting for a while now, but he's at peace with what's coming. Animals have a wisdom about these things that we sometimes lack. Reflect on this truth. The depth of our grief is always proportional to the depth of our affection. To care completely means to risk losing completely. And yet, would we choose differently?" "Will it hurt?" Henry asked, the question that had been weighing on his heart. "No," Dr. Morrison assured him. "It's very peaceful. He'll just fall asleep, and then his heart will stop. Many people say it's the kindest way, to go to sleep in the arms of someone you love, in a place where you feel safe." Henry nodded, understanding, but still struggling with the finality of it all. "I'd like to hold him," Henry said. Dr. Morrison helped Henry position himself so that Charlie's head rested comfortably in his lap. The dog's breathing was very shallow now, but his eyes remained open, focused on Henry's face with that unwavering devotion that had characterized their entire relationship. "Charlie, my good boy," Henry began, his voice steady despite the tears that had begun to fall. "You've been the best friend a man could ask for. You've taught me so much about loyalty, about affection, about what it means to live each day fully." The room seemed to hold its breath as Henry spoke. The fire continued to crackle softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "I want you to know that you made our house a home. You turned quiet mornings into adventures, lonely evenings into companionship. Even after Martha left us, you kept me going. You gave me a reason to get up every morning, a reason to keep living." Dr. Morrison made his final preparations, his movements respectful and unhurried. "Are you ready, Henry?" he asked gently. Henry took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 15 years of love and companionship in this single moment. "Yes," he whispered. "We're ready?" The veterinarian administered the injection with practiced skill and infinite gentleness. Charlie didn't even flinch. He simply continued to gaze into Henry's eyes with that expression of complete trust and love. "Sleep well, my friend," Henry whispered, stroking Charlie's soft fur. "Thank you for everything. Thank you for choosing us, for loving us, for being the best dog that ever lived." Charlie's breathing gradually slowed, became more peaceful. His eyes remained fixed on Henry's face, as if he wanted his human's face to be the last thing he saw in this world. There was no fear in that gaze, only devotion and trust and the serene acceptance that comes from a life fully lived. As the minutes passed, Henry felt Charlie's body relax completely. The transition was so gentle, so peaceful, that for a moment Henry wasn't sure it had happened. Dr. Morrison checked quietly for a heartbeat, then nodded to Henry. "He's gone," he said softly, very peacefully. Henry continued to stroke Charlie's fur, now still and silent. The golden coat that had caught sunlight on thousands of walks was now motionless, but somehow the affection remained, filling the room like an invisible presence. After Dr. Morrison left, Henry sat alone with Charlie for a long time. The fire continued to burn, casting warm light over the peaceful scene. Outside, night had fully settled over the Pennsylvania countryside, but inside, the room felt filled with the presence of all the love that had been shared within these walls. Contemplate this mystery. True devotion never really dies. It transforms, becoming memory, wisdom, and the capacity to care again. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, another beautiful autumn day in Pennsylvania. Henry woke slowly, feeling the absence of Charlie's presence like a physical ache. But as he looked out the window at the golden leaves dancing in the morning breeze, he felt something else too. Gratitude. Gratitude for 15 years of unwavering companionship. Gratitude for the lessons in loyalty and devotion that Charlie had taught him. Gratitude for the way a golden retriever puppy had transformed a quiet house into a home filled with joy and laughter. Henry made his coffee and sat in his chair by the window, looking out at the yard where Charlie had spent so many happy hours. As he sat there, Henry made a decision. He would continue their morning walks, not in sadness, but in celebration of all the beauty Charlie had taught him to see. The seasons turned, as they always do. Winter came to the Pennsylvania countryside, bringing the quiet that only winter knows. Henry continued his morning walks, sometimes carrying Charlie's favorite tennis ball in his pocket, a tangible reminder of all the joy they had shared. Spring arrived with its promise of renewal, bringing wildflowers to the forest floor and new life to Martha's garden. Henry found himself working in the soil, planting the vegetables and flowers that his wife had loved, feeling connected to both her memory and Charlie's through the simple act of nurturing growing things. And then, one warm May morning, as Henry was walking their familiar path through the woods, he heard something that made his heart skip a beat. A soft whimpering, coming from the direction of the old culvert where Charlie had once gotten himself stuck. Following the sound, Henry discovered a small golden retriever puppy, probably no more than 8 weeks old, dirty and frightened, but otherwise healthy. The puppy looked up at him with brown eyes that seemed remarkably familiar, tail wagging tentatively as if asking, "Are you my human?" Henry knelt down, extending his hand for the puppy to sniff. The little dog approached cautiously, then suddenly burst into enthusiastic tail wagging, as if recognizing something in Henry's gentle manner. "Well, hello there, little one," Henry said softly. "What are you doing out here all alone?" And as he lifted the puppy into his arms, Henry felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a stirring of joy, a quickening of the heart that reminded him of the first time he had held Charlie as a puppy. This wasn't Charlie returning. Henry understood that. But perhaps it was something else, life offering him another chance to care, another opportunity to be the kind of companion Charlie had taught him to be. The puppy settled into his arms with complete trust, as if understanding that safety had arrived. As Henry walked back toward the house, he found himself talking to his new companion, telling him about the wonderful life that awaited him, about the adventures they would share, about a golden retriever named Charlie who had taught him that devotion never really ends. It just finds new ways to express itself. "I think," Henry said to the puppy as they emerged from the forest into the golden morning light, "that someone sent you to me, someone who knew I was ready to love again, ready to give my heart to another furry friend who needed a home." The puppy looked up at him with those knowing brown eyes, as if to say, "I've been waiting for you too." And as they walked toward the farmhouse together, Henry realized that Charlie's greatest gift hadn't been his presence, but his teaching. He had shown Henry how to care completely, how to open his heart without reservation, how to find joy in simple moments. These lessons would live on, not just in Henry's memory, but in every act of kindness, every moment of companionship, every expression of affection that Henry would share with his new little soul. The most beautiful truth about devotion is this: it multiplies rather than divides. Every heart we open, every soul we touch with kindness, carries forward the affection we received, creating an endless chain of connection that stretches far beyond our own brief time on this earth. As Henry reached the farmhouse with his new companion, he looked back once toward the forest, where he and Charlie had shared so many precious moments. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves, creating a soft rustling that sounded almost like a whisper of approval, a blessing on this new beginning. "Thank you, Charlie," Henry said quietly. "Thank you for teaching me that devotion never really says goodbye. It just says, 'See you later,' and then shows up in new and wonderful ways." The puppy in his arms yawned and settled more deeply into Henry's embrace, ready to begin their journey together. And somewhere in the spring air, carried on the wind that had witnessed 15 years of morning walks and quiet companionship, there seemed to echo the gentle sound of a tail wagging in approval. Sometimes the most profound lessons come from the simplest teachers. If this story touched your heart, take a moment today to appreciate the affection in your own life, whether it walks on 2 legs or 4, whether it's present beside you or lives on in cherished memory. Devotion shared is never lost. It becomes the foundation for all the care that follows. If Henry and Charlie's journey moved you, I'd love to hear about your own special companion in the comments below. Share your story. Every tale of loyalty and love deserves to be told. And if this story brought you comfort or joy, a simple like helps others find these moments of connection too. For more stories that celebrate the beautiful bonds in our lives, consider subscribing, because sometimes we all need reminders of what truly matters.